Good morning, everybody. I am afraid I can't see everyone, but I think we have a quorum and we're ready to get started. So welcome, and it's wonderful to be here with you today, even if we are in Zoom right now. My name is Rachel Saunders. I'm the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Curator for Asian Art at the Harvard Art Museums, which I joined late in 2015, and I've just passed my 5-year anniversary, I know, which seems to have gone by very quickly. I'm really delighted to be here with you this morning with my colleagues Ruby Awburn, who's the Paintings Conservation Fellow at the Straus Center for Conservation and Technical Studies, and Mary Schneider Enriquez, who's the Houghton Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. This morning's session, we're going to focus about 40 minutes on a singular painting in our collection. Should we have the first slide, Ruby? Thank you. And it's this painting here in our collections at the Harvard Art Museums, which is titled Fuyu, or Winter, dated to 1960 by the Japanese-born painter Kumi Sugaï. Over the last year, Ruby has done the most incredible work on this painting, literally revivifying it. And of course, there are many paintings that get treated in our Straus Center, and each one has their own story. But we wanted to focus on this one today, not only because of the groundbreaking work Ruby has done on it, but because both the painting and her work raise some really pertinent issues about museum ecology and the life of objects in museums, and in our museums in particular. And while we've been working with a number of these issues for some years now, they have become all the more pressing in this present moment where we're all experiencing and navigating significant shifts in the cultural terrain. And the majority of the session will be taken by Ruby and by Mary, and I'm just going to start us off with a quick introduction to the painter, and then Mary's going to take over and put the work into context before we hand over to Ruby for a very special in-depth look at this painting, a look that you will never get again, I'm sure, and the unique treatment that she developed for it, as well as the incredible results that she achieved, and what those results mean is now possible both for this painting and for the stories that our collections can tell in the future. There'll be some time for questions at the end, and I would recommend that we, if you have a question, you don't have to wait till the end. You can type it into the chat function of Zoom, and we'll take the questions at the end. So should we move to the next slide, Ruby? Great, thank you. So here is Kumi Sugaï, who was born in 1919 in Kobe, and he also died in Kobe in 1996. He was born to Malay parents living in Japan, and he was actually based for the most significant years of his career in Europe, namely mostly in Paris. And although he's not exactly a household name in the US, his paintings and prints are in fact to be found in collections all over the globe, from New York to Rio de Janeiro, Paris to Johannesburg, Stockholm to Los Angeles, Kyoto, Tokyo, and beyond. And you see him here in this photograph in Paris, sitting on top of his car, what became his beloved fast car, his Porsche. Now, Sugaï enrolled at the Osaka School of Fine Arts in 1933 at the age of just 15. But in 1952, after the war, he left Japan to study in Paris. A mere 2 years later, he had his first solo exhibition there, and from there his reputation began to build in Europe. And then in 1959, he also begins to exhibit in New York at the Coots Gallery. Next slide. Thank you. So 1960, the year after he begins exhibiting in New York, he painted this painting, Fuyu. 1960 was really kind of a grand year for Kumi Sugaï. A very chic graphic, this book here was published about him with the text by the novelist André Pierre de Mandiargue. He also won prizes in Tokyo, and he completed a mural in Hamburg. And that was the year he also acquired the beloved Porsche, his fast car, which seems to have been both a symptom and a cause of his famed love of road travel and speed. From 1969, he began to make trips back to Japan, where he starts to receive commissions, one for a mural in the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo. And his reputation really began to rise in Japan from that point on. he had a retrospective in 1984 there. Now this 1960 account by André Pierre de Mandiac is really wonderfully evocative and intimate. It's really clear from his tone that he found Sugaï singular and intriguing, and he describes a visit to Sugaï's studio home, the location and circumstances of which are notably humble, but de Mandiac remarks upon the incredible discipline with which his paintings are arranged amidst the otherwise really quite undisciplined mixed-use space. He also describes Sugaï's rigorous working schedule, which was the same every day from the time of rising and breakfasting, which was then followed by an hour and a half of solo contemplation of the sky from the corner of a window on his first floor. He then went to work uninterrupted until 6 p.m. every day. And when he finished work, he would follow that with a game of table tennis, eat dinner, and then repose. Notably, Sugaï apparently ate the same menu every day at the same time as a means of avoiding expending useless nervous energy and pursuing a consistent schedule so as to maintain his equilibrium and his productivity. Now that description of his working routine is really quite at odds with the description of his character and perhaps his apparent love of speed and fast cars. But de Mandiac describes Sugaï as a person completely outside of time, in that he deliberately resists locating himself in any kind of linear historical time, but focuses entirely on presence in the moment. He also emphasizes his gentleness, his good humor, his propensity to laughter, and his warmth, which de Mandiac says characterize both his happy marriage and penetrate his paintings, almost every one of which invites the viewer to smile or to laugh. Let's have the next slide. So his early years in Paris, they seem to have been years that were solitary and quite difficult. Nevertheless, in the midst of adjusting to a new environment and a new language, we find him playing and experimenting with suggestive abstraction in new forms, many of which seem to relate back to Asia and to Japan. And this is one such painting titled Kabuki, now in the MoMA collection. And superficially, it seems like it might be a collection of suggestively abstract forms, but it's suggested to me, as my brain inevitably tried to articulate this image, it made me think of prints of the famous kabuki actor Ichikawa Danjiro from well-known early modern Japanese woodblock prints, like the following. Here's one from the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. Here are a few from our collection here. He also starts to play with calligraphic abstraction, as in the next slide here. This one is titled Oni, and he's playing with the relationship between text and image, addressing both the visual and textual aspects of language and the fundamental instability of that relationship, which is particularly clear in languages like Chinese and Japanese, which use logographs to express words. So here, if we have the next slide, we can see that Oni, which means demon in Japanese, what he's done here in this painting is sort of deconstructed and re-enlivened this calligraphic character here. And then we have, if we have the next slide, great. Here we're back to Fuyu here. So he's doing the same sort of thing here, playing with deconstructing and reanimating calligraphy. I think it's interesting to think about these paintings being executed in Paris, where he's experimenting in a new environment with the Japanese language and a kind of calligraphic modernism that might have been more possible there than in Japan. He may have had more freedom perhaps in Paris to re-territorialize his Asian script. Now, his later works, if we go to the next slide, manifest this interest in speed and movement that I've been referring to, and he develops here this sort of use of a specific vocabulary of geometric shapes that recur over the rest of his career and which are better known than the early works that we've just shown you. This is Autoroute numero 12, Autoroute number 12, in which you can see there's a repeated S-shaped curve structuring the painting, and there's sort of sense of dynamism in the shapes around it. And then the next slide, Ruby. Great. This is a painting from the series Rouge de Cadmian, or Cadmian Rouge. And this one dates to 1993, and it's sort of is illustrative of the development and refinement of his earlier tendencies. So if we go back to Fuyu, this painting here, this painting came to us in 1972, a gift of Samuel Coutts, And it came to the Asian collections, possibly because at the time, Kumi Sugaï was categorized as Japanese, an area classification, rather than being housed by temporal association with other modern paintings, many of which were housed in the Buschweisinger's Germanic collections. And when we look at this apparently simple decision, which was taken in the 1970s, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see it had big implications. It may not have been entirely conscious at the time, but the decision attempted to re-inscribe Sugaï's work into a Japanese history of art, working with oversimplistic associations between art and nation, against the best interests of a painting that is as fluid and unlocatable in many ways as the man described by de Mandiag. And as we look at it today, it really does demand us to ask, what do place and area designations even mean in the context of globalizing modernism? Now, a lot of the writing that there has been on Sugaï has been in the French and German language sphere. So as a work in our Asian collections, the painting received very little notice. And this sort of classificatory decision resulted in a situation in which the painting was effectively dormant in its isolation from the creative networks out of which it was born, and decentered by institutional architectures from a narrative of modernism in which Europe and America continued to be centered. As Ruby will share, though, its physical life was not nearly so static. So now that I've touched on the ways in which this painting did not thrive in the Asian collections, I'm going to hand over to Mary, who's going to tell us a bit more about the context in which Sugaï's work does thrive and what it can do there. Mary.
Thank you, Rachel. What is our next slide? Because I have to admit, I'm not. Okay, let's go back then. Starting here with a painting that I'm going to add to what Rachel was just talking about of the classification of this painting within our collection, and my extreme enthusiasm when Ruby brought this painting to my attention. And that is literally how I learned about this painting, although it is from 1960, and the abstract language and the manner in which it was painted and the scale in which it was painted on would have naturally been something that would have been considered for our mid-century abstraction galleries. But I was not aware of it because it was part of the Sackler, the Japanese collection, which frankly, because of the older system in which we housed and cared for and classified our paintings, meant that this kind of open awareness did not occur. So I start with that just to say that it was last fall, a year ago, when Ruby, as a new conservation fellow in her 2-year program, brought this painting out of storage and asked Rachel and I to meet with her to look at this, to see whether she was very interested in doing conservation work on it. Would we be supportive and excited by this idea? And both of us had the same reaction, coming at this from our different disciplines and our different perspectives of, this would be fantastic. And I have to say that for me in particular, the excitement ranged from my long interest in Japan post-war 50s to 60s, and that this artist was part of that. And the fact is, our collection at the Harvard Art Museums did not include work from Japan at that point in a way in which it was part of the dialogue that was being taught in art history classes and placed in the galleries. Hence, I wasn't aware of this particular painting. Let's please go to the next painting. Thank you. Sugaï, although, as Rachel said, was in many museums, and he did receive extraordinary attention. He was in Documenta several times. He had solo exhibitions. He was at the Carnegie International 4 different times, at the Sao Paulo Biennial. He won an artist prize in the early 60s. In terms of the international attention he received, he was considered a leading artist, which is really, really interesting, because when we think of our own collection, or I think of the scholarship I knew about Japan as well, particularly from the 50s, he was not someone readily mentioned. This is an example of a work, Shiro, which is in the Guggenheim collection in New York, in which they talk about his work in the context of Japan post-war, if you look this up on the website. But I would also say that very much directly links to the kinds of imagery and the kinds of exploration visually that Sugaï was very much practicing at this time in the late 50s and early 60s. As Rachel pointed out, he moved to Paris in 1952, and he was very much a part of the Paris school and New Realism, and the kind of abstraction that you see here was very much a part of what he was exploring. with a canvas of a large scale and a calligraphic image, just as Rachel pointed out and can explain with much more detail, which I find I learned so much from hearing her perspective on thinking about the actual specificity of these lines, and that it is not just purely abstract kind of Adolf Gottlieb kind of imagery that we're seeing. May I have the next slide, please? In addition to the Guggenheim, the Museum of Modern Art collected his work. Actually, in the late 50s and early 60s, this work, Kabuki, as Rachel has already pointed out to you, was acquired then in the late 50s and was included in an exhibition of new acquisitions, Art in a Changing World, in 1964. And I show you this slide from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, in which it's installed. And Sugaï's work is installed next to the painting on the right, which is by Hans Hartung, who was considered one of the great abstract painters internationally and in New York at the time. And in the next painting on the far right, the very dark calligraphic figure is a painting by German artist Willy Baumeister, who figures importantly in our collection, and actually, I will say, his painting hangs in our, we have two paintings by him that are in particular that I love, that hang in our mid-century abstraction gallery, and only one of them at this moment. But the fact of the matter in bringing this up and showing this context is, at that time, the Museum of Modern Art was placing Sugaï in the context of these abstract painters who were considered kind of world figure in their explorations. May I have the next, please? I have a particular interest in Japan post-war, and my initial reaction to this moment and the discussion with Ruby and Rachel, and I talked to Rachel about it before, was because I'm fascinated by the Gutai movement. Now, Sugaï was not a part of it. He was in Paris, and the Gutai movement was based in Japan. It was a group of artists who basically came together, even wrote a manifesto in 1956. They began in 1954, but they were really a group of artists who did performance, they did painting, they did installation. It was very much a lively and art as a popular and kind of let's interact with the people movement that was responding against the kind of restrictive, reactionary kind of oppressive way in which the art world was and the cultural world post-World War II. And this group, the Gutai, developed many things in the mid-50s that led to some of the great work that happened in the 60s in New York. I mean, the link between this kind of creating work, a Dada-esque almost, in public, bringing in and engaging a public as well as the artists themselves, and physically using body to paint. So I show you here because for those of you who get to galleries in New York or Paris, you will often see Shiraga, whose painting is here. He was one of the Gutai painters who literally physically used his body to paint, and this was very Gutai. So I want to catch, we at this point aren't going to have easily a painting from Gutai with us, but we are going to have and celebrate through Sugaï the fact that post-World War II in Japan, there was an opening up, and Rachel made a point of stating that perhaps that Kumi Sugaï was able to do more by going to Paris than he would have been staying in Tokyo. I think that it was a moment in which a lot of artists were pushing against what had always been, and there were reactions that included leaving the country or staying and making the Gutai movement, for example. And I think we're fortunate enough to have in our collection an example of someone who stepped away and decided to do his own thing by going abroad. You have the next, please. So I'm going to wrap this all up and around by saying the most exciting part of this, in addition to my own complete fascination and passion with the art of the 50s in Japan and early 60s in particular, especially in painting, but was that, you know, when I was hired in this position, I was hired as a modern contemporary curator to make our perspective at the Harvard Art Museums more global. And this was a moment in time in Japan that was really important art historically, yet as I've already talked, the work had not been focused on and had not been actually actively collected. This was a gift, as Rachel mentioned. And then the work was not seen. And so it took what is so great about our museum, this brilliant young conservator, to come in and find something that in our wonderful collection, both in storage and in galleries, she found something that I was not aware of. Rachel, I don't believe was fully aware of, but I don't mean to speak for her, but Ruby came in and said, I'd like to work on this work. And it is a painting that needed an extraordinary amount of attention to be able to be seen. And she brought the three of us together in this way that is so wonderful about our jobs, is that we all are a team, we learn from each other, and we support and get extremely excited about what we learn from each other. And this project with Ruby is the kind of epitome of that, and one of the reasons I find it a joy and a great pleasure to work at the museums with the new and up and coming scholars and conservators like you, Ruby, and Rachel as well. So please tell us all that you were able to do.
Thank you. Fuyu came to the conservation labs around October in 2019. And the condition of Fuyu was unstable and fragile, so much so that it was unexhibitable. Superficially, Fuyu's main condition issues were the severe interlayer cleavage and flaking across the surface of the painting. And interlayer cleavage is where paint splits between layers. In more acute areas of lifting, the paint was curling away from the ground and sometimes having split the ground layers. Here are some close-up images of the flaking and interlayer cleavage. And in more dramatic areas of lifting, as you can see here, the paint was physically curling away from the ground. And there were also these little wax-like globules protruding through the paint in areas. Old adhesive residue and overpaint were apparent across the painting, where someone had tried to cover up losses. This intervention would have occurred prior to museum acquisition in 1972, indicating that the painting experienced flaking within 12 years of being produced. But as you can see here, the old adhesive had failed. It is still adhered to the paint, but it has pulled away in strings, which indicates that the force of the curling and lifting paint was stronger than the force of the adhesive. What to make of all these symptoms? Well, let's pause and think about paint for a second. The two main components of paint are a pigment and a binder. The pigment is the colored powder, which gives the paint its hue, and the binder is the medium which the pigments are bound in. And you can interchange the binder depending on what type of paint you'd like to make, such as oil or acrylic. With modern pre-mixed paints, different ingredients are added by manufacturers to change the working properties, so bulking it out or making it dry faster. And these additives can influence the way a paint layer ages over time. With the condition issues, which covered Fuyu from head to toe, I knew we needed to collaborate with the conservation scientists to diagnose what reaction was occurring. Georgina Rayner, the Straus's associate conservation scientist, took multiple samples, which are typically the size of a pinhead, from across the painting, and a few of the sample sites are depicted here. The samples were analysed with various techniques that are listed on your screen to determine what materials are present in the painting and what reaction is taking place. And most of these instruments live in the analytical lab on the 4th floor of the museum, and they can inform us of a sample's chemical makeup. So here is a cross-section from a flake that fell off the painting. You can see the beautiful and clear stratigraphy of the paint layers, from the beautiful smooth white ground layer to the individual layers of red, black, and brown paint. However, if we zoom in on what is occurring at the bottom of the sample, you can see these little crystals forming in the ground layer. In combination with all the other analytical techniques, the results revealed that the interlayer cleavage was being caused by the formation of these little crystals. They are called Zinccarboxylates, or also known as zinc soaps. Let's think back to the basic components that make up paint, a pigment and a binder. So metal soaps are the physical manifestation of a reaction between the metals in a pigment and the free fatty acids from the oil that it is bound in. And the formation of these organometallic compounds often result in various chemical and physical symptoms, including the flaking of paint, pinpoint losses, small wax-like aggregates on the surface, paint transparency, and efflorescent crusts. For zinc soaps, the reaction occurs when the zinc ion from the zinc white pigment reacts with the fatty acids in the oil. But pigment properties, oil composition, paint additives, and environmental conditions are all significant factors in this process. While oil-based paintings from all periods can be affected by some form of metal soap degradation, and they're tricky because they present in so many different ways, modern paintings are by far the worst affected, and this is because of the introduction of new materials. Zinc white was not seriously considered an artist's pigment until the end of the 18th century, although there are known examples found earlier. And its popularity rose when there was concern around lead poisoning due to lead white paint during the Industrial Revolution. Its widest application is as a watercolor pigment under the name of Chinese white, which became available by Winsor and Newton as early as 1834. And by 1850, zinc white was made as a commercially available oil paint. In terms of modern paint production, zinc oxide is often included as a lightener and bulking agent, as well as for purely white paints. So throughout the 20th century, zinc oxide was intentionally and unintentionally used by many artists as its prevalence in both white and colored paint formulations increased. Some artists we know who extensively use zinc white oil paint include Pablo Picasso, Franz Kline, and the Australian artist Sidney Nolan, just to name a few. But looking back at Fuyu and combining all the information we have learned from analysis, it became evident that both phases of zinc soap formation were present, amorphous and crystalline. So amorphous soaps indicate the first stage in zinc soap formation and are often found in aged paint. The metal carboxylate ionomer, which you could probably think of as seeds, lay dormant in the paint layer. And the hydrolysis of esters in the oil chains provide free fatty acids for the formation of crystalline zinc soaps, which is the second stage of zinc soap formation. Hydrolysis is the chemical breakdown due to water, and that includes moisture and humidity from the air. And so the seeds have food and therefore sprout, and it's these crystalline soaps that cause the embrittlement and delamination of the paint. An analysis also identified that the paint layers directly on top of the zinc white ground are providing the source of those fatty acids for the soaps to form. Lead soaps were also found on the surface of the painting, and they're soaps that form within lead-containing paint layers, and then they migrate to the surface of the painting, resulting in these wax-like lumps. Treatment of paintings with soaps is problematic, as solvents, heat, and water influence the formation and migration of these soaps. So how do you stick a painting back together without water, solvent, or heat? Unfortunately, to my knowledge, this isn't possible. And what most surprised me while researching for this treatment is that there is very minimal discussion about how conservators are treating these issues. There are plenty of case studies out there regarding testing various methods of identifying soaps, cleaning and consolidating mock-ups, scientific modelings of how soaps are formed and what not to do as a conservator, but astonishingly little about the treatment and resulting long-term effect of that intervention. Hence, I wound up in an interesting conundrum, considering various theoretical concepts surrounding conservation decision-making and risk analysis. Do nothing is an option that has been advocated for in several texts as the outcome of introducing heat, solvent, or water will, in high probability, catalyze this saponification and crystallization process. However, the painting was in such a fragile state that if it was to be left laying flat in storage, it could never be put on display and it would continue to degrade on its own. So the other option was to consolidate the interlayer cleavage, and consolidation is basically sticking something back together. This was an interesting risk to consider as it could stabilize the painting long enough for display, but it could also catalyze the formation of more soaps, prompting continued treatment and monitoring, or the painting to go back into storage. Thus, the treatment turned into a weighting of risks. But luckily, it lives in a museum dedicated to research with a team of in-house conservators. And this thought process led me to my research question. Is there a way to stabilize a painting exhibiting severe flaking due to zinc soap formation in a manner that allows the painting to be exhibited? And what are the long-term effects of this treatment? And it's the second part of this research question, the long-term effects, which will be contributing to new research regarding metal soaps on paintings. Consulting with experts on metal soaps in works of art and through my own research, it was clear that introducing water in any form was off the table. Solvent testing revealed most of the pigments to be sensitive to most of the solvents that you would generally use in consolidation, although some were better than others. I also had to consider using heat to set down the curled flakes, as the paint needed to be plasticized to lie flush on the canvas. Conducting a few tests, I decided to use Beaver and a heated spatula to consolidate. This is my little heated spatula, and Beaver is a conservation grade adhesive that comes in a paste or a solid form, and we dissolve it into a solvent to make it liquid to deliver to the painting, and then it is set with heat. And as I worked, introducing this Beaver and setting the flakes down, numerous micro cracks and lifting popped up across the surface of the painting. And the speed at which this occurred was initially worrying. However, the more adhesive I fed in, the less this reaction occurred. Fill materials were another issue that I needed to consider. In order to not introduce any materials that contained water or any solvents that may swell the adhesive, I decided to use an unpigmented wax resin. And this is kind of the consistency of candle wax. And while it still introduced an element of heat, there was no fear of solvent or water. And in fact, it worked really well and there were no visible reactions. And then I in-painted these fells with a material called core colors, and they're a synthetic water style type paint. And here you can see the after treatment results. The adhesive appears to have held nicely, and I was able to get the curled paint flush with the canvas again. But now that I've introduced solvent into the painting, I could have triggered a reaction that might cause more soaps to form. So to quantitatively measure the long-term effects of my intervention, I decided to use reflective transformation imaging, or RTI. And RTI is a computational photographic method that captures an object's surface shape. These images are created from multiple digital images of an object shot from a stationary camera, and in each photograph, the light is projected from a different known location, and you merge all of those together. Conservation literature based on the work by Dale Conkright from the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum states that this kind of imaging can detect really small damages or changes occurring on the surface by comparing and subtracting these scans. As the painting is so large, I've chosen an area which has been heavily treated as a sample area representative of the treatment across the painting, and I'll compare scans taken, although the schedule has had to be revised due to COVID-19 restrictions and working from home, but likely at about 8 months and 1 year post-treatment, to see and assess the effect that my intervention has had on the possible formation of these soaps. So this will allow us to form a long-term plan for the painting's care. And other elements of research I've been undertaking regarding the technical study of his work. I traveled to New York to see the MoMA and Guggenheim paintings, which both Mary and Rachel mentioned earlier, which was beneficial in contextualizing Sugaï's paintings. An examination allowed for cross-referencing of Sugaï's technique and a deeper understanding of his practice. Comparison also confirmed that the condition of Fuyu is not ubiquitous across his work and may be a unique case, potentially related to environmental fluctuations, but that in itself is another discussion. So Fuyu represents an extreme example of zinc soap formation and the associated degradation phenomena. And as such, it's an ideal case study for monitoring this potential effect that any intervention may have had on the associated soap formation. And as I mentioned earlier, this research is new and will be contributing to a global conservation discourse on how to treat modern paintings with soaps. So I'll just hand back to Mary.
So where does this take us? This incredible work that Ruby has conducted, and my enthusiasm and Rachel's enthusiasm for the painting, it is now in a condition that it could be hung again. And I'm telling you a somewhat secret, because I haven't had a full discussion with my modern and contemporary curatorial colleagues, but my idea would be to hang this particular painting in the gallery with that is mid-century abstraction, right off the courtyard on the ground floor of our museum. So with Franz Klein, with Jackson Pollock, who we know Sugaï was fully aware of, with David Smith, with Gottlieb, and with Willy Baumeister, with whom he's been hung before. So, and this would interject another more global element to a gallery that has previously had both European and American artists, but we have not had an Asian artist as part of the international dialogue. So thanks to Ruby, this process of thinking about it can occur, and this is a possibility. So when we're open post-COVID-19, come see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we'd be happy to open it up to any questions if anybody has any in the chat or would like to unmute themselves. I'm glad we went so in depth. We've answered them all already.
Can I ask a question, Ruby?
Yes, please.
Watching the treatment and hearing about your thought process, I mean, I saw it in action to a certain extent, but hearing it all together in one place, that just brings it all, sort of distills it in a way. And I was just wondering for you, what was the most sort of tension-inducing part of this treatment? It's all very new, and you're doing something very, you're making a research contribution here in a living work of art, literally a living work of art. So I wondered,
Yes.
who was the most tricky, the most nerve-wracking part of it?
I think after completing, so I completed all of the research about soaps, reading about how other conservators have been treating paintings, because it is a huge issue in any painting that has a potential zinc oxide and oil. For example, there's, a lot of Mondrians, a lot of Picassos that are flaking, and people don't know what to do with them, because any interaction with the solvents that we use in our adhesives or water that we use will keep this reaction occurring. So really, it is all nerve-wracking, but you work on such a small scale and you do all of this thorough testing that by the time you are introducing anything in, any heat, any solvent, you know that it's safe. The most nerve-wracking part was when things would be popping, like paint flakes would be popping off the painting, and I will have spent an entire week sticking it down, full-time, 8 hours a day, trying to stick it back together. And then I would come in on Monday and all of these little flakes had popped off, and they're only maybe 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter, very small. And the painting is quite large. So it was scanning the painting daily to see how many things had popped off. But as I said, the more I put this adhesive, which is a conservation grade adhesive. It was invented by a conservator in the 90s or 80s, and it is meant to last 100 years or so. So yeah, it was a nerve-wracking treatment. There's a lot of unknowns when it's not as straightforward as giving something a nice clean.
We had a question about the involvement of undergraduates in conservation, and from teaching, and I know Rachel can as well, that we spend a lot of time in the seminar that Makita and I taught. We took students up for several of our sessions in the seminar and had in-depth, time learning directly from conservators working on projects. But I don't know if, I don't know myself about whether there are internships for undergraduates and engagement with student guides. That I don't know if either of you could offer your sense on that.
I know that we're involved in 2 classes with the School of Art History and Architecture. There are 2 classes that are taught that are based on technical art history and learning to look and using our different techniques of investigation. And we're always open to talking. We always have people popping in and talking to the student guides, and I've done a few things for them before as well.
Also last night, Narayan spoke about the funding for new fellowship internship. So that was
an internship.
Actually, internship. So that actually was coming out of college. Is that right? I wasn't completely clear on that.
No. So before you go to do your graduate program in conservation, you need to, in America, you need to rack up a certain amount of practical hours of experience. And usually we'd call them a conservation technician. And they're quite difficult to, I know that Isabella Stewart Gardner has a great internship program for racking up pre-program hours, and you need about 100 or something. So this internship program will be providing a student or someone who has done their undergraduate degree and is thinking about doing a master's in conservation access to those training hours.
Great. Ruby, there's a question in the chat from Stephen Mayer asking about the introduction of the adhesive, the Beaver, I think it is, that meant to last 100 years. And I would like to know what evidence there is, what knowledge we have to back that up, how it will last for another 100 years.
Oh, yes. So in terms of, you can find, there's a lot of fun conservation literature out there where people have done accelerated aging tests on various types of adhesives that we use. And if something is conservation A grade, it is meant to last 100 to 100-ish years or so, and that's considered the cream of the crop, the best kind of material that you can use. But also, as we are governed by a board of ethics and code of conduct, which is the American Institute of Conservation, all of our materials also have to be reversible. So there's a whole documentation process of where I've included this adhesive in the painting so that someone can come along and take it out one day if they need to.
Great. Thank you, Ruby. That's fantastic. I think we're almost at time, so to allow people to move to the next session, I just want to say again how amazing this work is, Ruby. To hear you talking about setting down escaped millimeter pieces of paint onto this canvas again, which is going to make it possible to make this incredible painting visible, and not just this painting, but the changing the narrative that we've had in America about what global modernism means to include this painter. Again is tremendous to go from paint flakes to what's going to be in the galleries and changing the art historical narrative. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. I know there are several other sessions for people to attend this morning, so I hope you'll enjoy those and that we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.